priest in guiding confession and amendment of life. To put it bluntly, it brought canon law down from the great legal minds of Antioch and Laodicea and made canon law through the Penitentials something that could be communicated very facilely to your average Belgian peasant. Little b. The modern equivalent of the Penitentials is the examination of the conscience. That work that we read on Good Friday every year. It's one thing to say, lust is sin in theoretical Greek. It's another thing to explain to someone what that means. We still do every Good Friday the examination of the conscience. It's a penitential. It's canon law brought down to the level of how did you live today?
When you talk about guiding confession, are you talking about Catholic confession?
I'm talking about people who have sinned and want to be reconciled. Like in 1 Corinthians, the man who was living with his in incest. And if you want to be reconciled back into the fellowship, what do you have to do? Number 2, the Penitentials brought canon law to laymen in the form of specific moral guidance. Number 3, most of the penitentials were written in the form of offense/penance. Friends, penance is so misunderstood. Luther did not abolish penance in the church. He abolished the belief that penance earns you forgiveness. The idea of penance is pedagogic, to communicate to you how deeply you have offended God so that you will remember not to do it again. There's a tendency amongst American evangelicals to look at the practice of penance as some medieval Roman invention that's supposed to buy you salvation. Penance was introduced into the earliest days of the church as a way of communicating to men and women the nature of sin. It's a very healthy thing. And in the minds of these quasi-barbarians who had come out of the woods of South Central Asia and taken over Europe, they thought in terms of offense, penalty, much like English common law, Anglo-Saxon law, and it really communicated to them. There is no way to exaggerate the civilizing impact of the Penitentials on Western Europe. The Penitentials were the only law in most of Europe.
So this was, these were basically dispensed by the priests, so the barbarians would be forgiven for raping and pillaging?
Raping and pillaging, and to show them the types of things that were considered Christian behavior. Let me give you an example of let me give 3 illustrations. One of my favorites. I didn't say that. It sounds odd. Maybe it sounds like it's wrong for me. It's not. Vomiting on account of drunkenness. Not drunkenness, but getting so drunk you vomit. It was a huge problem. The Celts, well, they still do. Ever been to an Irish wake? You know, you heard me. The only difference, you know what the difference is between an Irish wake and an Irish wedding? Just one less drunk in a wake. I mean, these are drinking people. You know, we left Dr. Van Dyke in a pub in Scotland, and he's still there, and that was 2 months ago. I mean, these are drinking people. And they would drink themselves into a stupor. And the way that the Penitentials communicate this is the penitential for the Celts, it's called the Irish Penitential. If you vomit a kind of drunkenness, that you do 15 days of penance. For 15 days, you do acts of contrition. To really solidify in your mind and your heart that's no. That's if you're a lay person. If you're a priest, it's 40 days of penance. Now, remember, these were people who just recently had been worshiping trees and flowers. So in the Northern European penitentials, the use of incantations or magical devices you had to do a year of penance for. But they weren't all just culturally specific things like Irish drunkenness and consulting 4-leaf clovers. One of the rules is someone who loves in mind only. If someone says they love you with their mouth, but don't love you with their actions, someone who's guilty of that had to do for every time they said it, 7 days of penance, public penance. It's the sin.
Public penance or what kind of thing?
Oh.
Is that community service? Or
Yes, it varied. Public penance, for one thing, you had to sit in the front of the church, which is, you know, from St. Albans would be real punishment. Everybody heads for the back 4 pews. Yeah. You had to sit in the front of the church, you know, and so people knew that you were under penance. You had to do acts of contrition, which meant that usually there was a service and you would have to do like community service, or public service to the church. The idea of, you know, saying the rosary and all of that became Roman Catholic penance in the Middle Ages. There was no rosary before the 13th century. You had to go do something to remind you that what you'd done was wrong.
People took it seriously.
And they took it seriously. You weren't allowed to take Holy Communion while you were doing penance. So if you had, you know, had a rabbit's foot and that was considered divination, that's a whole year. And someone who kept falsely saying, "I love you, babe," and then not showing it with their actions, 7 days of penance, I mean, you know, you keep that up, you know, you never get mean it. Plus, you have to understand that in what are called small societies, small communities, public humiliation is a very effective tool of social control. It's something that we have lost in our culture that's unfortunate. Embarrassment is a great way to get people to conform to good behavior. One of the reasons why Japanese society has such a low crime rate in American society is the Japanese practice social control through humiliation. You do something wrong, you know, you have to wear a sign around your neck that, you know, says, you know, "I'm a big fat idiot." And it really is effective. Capital D. Canon law before the Reformation. just two more points on it. Canon law before the Reformation. Number one. In 1140, the scholar Gratian, 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 compiled the, and here's the name of the book, Decretum, Decretum. Comma, a compilation of, now remember, this is a time when traveling the equivalent of from Brea to Pasadena to Sierra Madre would be considered a life-threatening trip and maybe take you weeks. There was, things were so chaotic. Yet he traveled around Europe and compiled a compilation of 3,458 texts of canon principles. If Gratian missed it, it probably wasn't worth finding. And he searched everything, the church fathers, Holy Scripture, the councils of the church, letters from bishops to their clergy, everything he get his hands on. He read the Penitentials, and he came up with 3,458 texts of canon principles, canon law. Not 3,458 separate laws, but texts on the laws. Number two.
Can you synthesize them, or can you just put them in?
No, he just listed them. It's just volume after volume.
The titles, or did he actually copy them all?
Down, verbatim. But here you had in one place for the first time since the Hispania, 600 years earlier, everything available on church law.
This guy preached.
Yes. At the University of Bologna in Italy. Number two. In 1503, Jean Chapuis, Jean, G-E-A-N, Jean in French, Chapuis, C-H-A-P-U-I-S, which I won't tell you what that means. Jean Chapuis published the Corpus Juris Canonici. Corpus, C-O-R-P-U-S, means body. Juris, J-U-R-I-S, means law. Canonici means canon, C-A-N-O-N-I-C-I. Corpus Juris Canonici, largely based upon Gratian. Which became the authoritative law of the Western Church. Incidentally, the Corpus Juris Canonici was the law of the Roman Catholic Church from 1503 till 1917, and then was only slightly revised in 1917. Roman Catholic canon law wasn't rewritten after Jean Jean Chapuis until 1989. They were still working from his body of work. Now, you see, he didn't come up with the laws, he just compiled, you see.
What year was it revised?
1917, then again in 1989.
Did he improve upon immigration somehow?
What he did is he did exactly what you asked earlier, he synthesized it. So you had all the marriage canons in one place.
Oh, okay. So basically, he just reorganized it and brought it into modern language.
And wrote it in modern Latin.
How does the pre-Reformation canon law factor into the dispute over Anglican orders, their own Catholic Church? They recognize the same body of canon law.
Well, this is the question that was in place before the Romans for 99 years. Anglican orders in Rome. Because our orders follow the same canon law that theirs do. And the Roman Church is a real problem because there's one pope, and who issued a decree on Anglican orders, and now they have to live with it, but they can't justify it. He said it, but they can't explain why. He didn't give an explanation. He just said it. It's really unfortunate.
So until 1917, the Roman Catholic Church and the rest of the evangelicals or whatever reform, they share the same kind of law?
No. As a matter of fact, the Lutherans kept Jean Chapuis' canon law with changes concerning the Pope. The Calvinists never just threw out canon law completely and made everything subject to a local board in their interpretation of Scripture. And that's still where it is today. So let's say that, let's just use marriage. Let's say you wanted an annul, you didn't think you had a valid marriage, Carol. You'd gotten out of the harem, you came to me, and you said, I don't think I have a valid marriage. We have canonical principles from the Council of Nicaea that we use. If you were a Calvinist, if you were a Presbyterian church, you would go for your presbytery, your board. They would decide on the basis of how they interpret your situation and how they interpret the Scripture. There is no set principle.
Did they not go on precedent from previous presbytery boards and all that? Is any of that recorded though?
Oh, yeah. But they don't want to have a body of canon. They want everything to be spontaneous. Let's talk about canon law after the Reformation in Anglicanism. Capital E, canon law after the Reformation in Anglicanism. Number one, the principal change in the Anglican Reformation regarding canon law was abolishing appeals to Rome. Did you know that prior to 1989, if you were divorced and a Roman Catholic and you wanted to get remarried, the paperwork had to go to Rome? no matter where you were in the world. See? If there was a situation where a local congregation wanted to remove their priest, the Bishop of Argyll, the Roman Catholic Bishop of Argyll, just ran off. He's in Scotland. Just ran off with a married woman. That's a no-no. But let's say your priest ran off with a married woman, but he was still getting his salary from the church and you wanted to remove him. Today, if Father, we'll call him Father Fred, Father Ted, at St. Angela's ran off with the checker at Albertsons down the street. In order for St. Angela's to replace him, it has to go to Rome. Not to Orange to the bishop, it's got to go to Rome. If you want your baby baptized and the priest says no, I don't like you, and you want to appeal it, it goes to Rome. Everything got moved to Rome. Have you ever heard the phrase, all roads lead to Rome? That does not come from classical antiquity. It's a canon law statement from the Middle Ages. Everything went to Rome.
Is the whole church divided by law? Why Rome?
Because the decision was made at the Lateran Council, which wasn't a real, I think it was in 1215, that the ultimate authority would be the Bishop of Rome.
If it wasn't an ecumenical council, then why did it stand to be abolished?
Well, that's exactly what Thomas Cranmer said, which led to the Anglican Reformation. He said, wait a minute, that wasn't an ecumenical council. They have no right to say that.
It wasn't really abolishing it, it was just weeding out.
Weeding out, it wasn't abolishing, it was reforming it. It was going back to original principle. Why go to Rome?
Okay, so first we had this canon law that the early church had, and then along the way, Catholics started having their own councils and adding stuff to it. That's what we're talking about. And then,
Were they the only ones who had councils?
Yeah, the Eastern churches.
and are they adding stuff to this also? So it's just with Romans.
Romans. Everybody else froze after the Second Council of Constantinople because there was no more, everything was done. And there was no need to add. The Romans kept adding things, and they always had to do with the papacy, with the Pope. Always had to do with Rome. They didn't change. This is a good question, because they didn't further define the marriage canons. It was the same marriage canons the church had had for 1,000 years. They just kept adding things about Rome. More and more structure and structure and structure. It was like bureaucracy gone berserk. It was like the IRS. They just kept adding stages of things.
Okay, there's this is likely a subject you're going to take up later, so squelch it if need be. But if the Episcopal Church, for example, can pass on things which obviously are contrary to canon law, I'm thinking particularly about the marriage canon and all this type of stuff. How can they justify it? Have they changed canon law in the Episcopal Church?
Yes, and you see, you cannot. The corpus of canon law, which is the canonical tradition of the church in its first 5 centuries, the canons of the Ecumenical Council, which all canon law is based, which is just an interpretation of Holy Scripture, it can't be changed. Who are we to say, because you have to say everyone was wrong. The apostles were wrong, the apostles' disciples were wrong, they misunderstood, we got it right. And it's terribly arrogant. Let's finish, that's a good point. We already talked about some length changing canon law. Number 2, canon law in England was codified in 1604. That was the reign of James I, the same man who authorized the translation of the King James Bible. There hadn't been a distinctly English version of the canons. So in 1604, the convocations of Canterbury and York, the two great church bodies in England, got together and codified all of the canon law, making sure there was nothing left over from medieval Roman Catholicism. And essentially, that's the canon law we have today. Number 3, essentially, canon law in England is based on the CJC, that's Corpus, Juris, Canonici. The CJC, which is based on Gratian, which is based on, you understand,
So it's pre-Roman.
with adjustments made for conformity to the 39 articles. Number 4.
How much strength was there? In arguing for precedent, in the church, was council, as far as I understand, the Roman Catholics argue that the traditions and spiritual life of the church.
We're going to talk about this custom. I want to explain to you, I want to keep this on one table, and I don't have this to you on potatoes. You understand that in England, up until this century, canon law had the force of law. So that divorce, for example, was not granted, annulity was not granted by the state, it was granted by the church. There were certain offenses which were tried in church courts, not in civil courts.
Even for people who are not members of the church?
Even for people who were members of the church. Quakers had to go to C of E, Church of England courts. For example, certain types of lawsuits were settled by the church courts up until this century. And questions of inheritance were settled by the church courts, not by the civil courts. Gradually, starting with William Gladstone, the Liberal Prime Minister of the 19th century, and finally ending right after World War I, the canon courts in England have been virtually abolished. The only real thing left of canon law in the English church is you can still go to jail for blasphemy, which I think is hilarious. I mean, it's great, but you can still go to jail for blasphemy if you want. But everything else has disappeared. So number 4, this is our last point this evening. Number 4, the strict separation of church and state in the United States made some statutes of the 1604 canons unenforceable. So appropriate revisions have been made. You might say that our canon law, like our prayer book, is the English canon law without the monarchy. Now, our prayer book was revised to remove references to the monarchy and some other things. So our canon law was adjusted in this country to reflect our need to submit to American constitutional law. Do you understand? We don't threaten anyone with jail in canon law, for example, because we can't. Oh, for the good of the cause, you know. So the canon law under which our church operates is essentially an American rewriting for the purposes of our peculiar situation in a republic. I'm repeating so this is okay. Which is based upon the canons of 1604 of the Church of England, based upon the Corpus, Juris, Canonici, based upon Gratian, based upon the Hispania, based upon the Diocesiana, based upon the ecumenical councils, all based upon the Word of God.
Should, if, the Chapuis guy, if his stuff was pre-Roman, right? So around what year approximately did the Romans start adding things?
Well, they started adding things to canon law in before Chapuis.
Like he didn't include them in
No,
this?
no. You see, they made, they added 10 different consular groups of statutes to Chapuis after Chapuis was published.
Is that what was adjusted out to Canonicism? So they didn't take anything out of Chapuis themselves.
No,
Basically, they just went back to the original Chapuis.
to the original Chapuis. And it's things like, it's not just like appeals to Rome, it's things like the Roman canon law has all these rules for what happens if you violate, like you run off with the sacrament. Or my favorite, what happens if a mouse eats the sacrament? You put him in a box, take him to a monastery, and allow him to live out his life, then bury him in consecrated ground, in Roman law.
So the Catholics
Hmm?
and Catholics.
I suppose he becomes a martyr, Saint Mickey.
You hang your cat.
Well, there are provisions, there are provisions for executing animals in Roman canon law.
Because they eat the wafer.
No, it's, they're completely hard on cats.
Rightly so.
Now, next week, I know this has been somewhat pedantic, but next week, we're going to talk about the characteristics of canon law, variable versus invariable standards. How are exceptions made? Who makes that decision? And when we get to really, really emotional issues like local custom, what do you do if you go into an area, the big one was polygamy. When our missionaries arrived in sub-Saharan Africa, we were suddenly faced with men who were converting to Christianity who had 6, 7, 8, 9 wives. How does canon law adjust to local custom? What do you do in a culture where you're faced with matriarchy as opposed to patriarchy? You see, when the church came to North America with the Native Americans, a man could not divorce his wife, but a woman could divorce her husband simply by throwing his clothes out of the TV. You see, what do you do when you hit local custom that is so remarkably different? What do you do with Inuit culture, the culture of Alaska and northern Canada, where it's considered extremely rude to house guests not to have them sleep with your wife?